Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all. This is the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North, Canada's most irreverent talk show. It is Thursday, and as you can see, not in the usual digs. Hopefully next week we'll go back to a bit more programming normalcy, but I'm actually in Ottawa right now. Nothing to do with foreign interference. I'm not having any, clandestine meetings with the Chinese embassy or anything like that. Not that I know of anyway. But I am here for the book launch that I had last night. No, sorry. Wasn't a book launch because we held it in a room on Parliament Hill, and there's a rule that you can't have a book launch, but you can have a book reception. So we had a book reception, which looks a lot like a book launch, but totally not a book launch. But in any event, it is good to talk to you here, and I appreciate all the news that has been happening as I've been on the road. I've been trying to desperately keep up with it, but we did start a little bit earlier in the week delving into this foreign interference report from the NSICOP or NSICOP. I hear both pronunciations. This is a report that came from multiple members of parliament who are cleared for top secret intelligence, and they found the extent of foreign interference was, I would argue, far worse than what most Canadians were aware of. It isn't just China, it's Iran, it's India, other redacted countries. But the key part here is not that these countries are trying to interfere and in many cases succeeding in interfering in our democracy. The issue is that Canadian parliamentarians, MPs, and senators are wittingly, as the report says, wittingly ceding their national pride, their patriotism, their obligation, their oath to Canada. They are wittingly throwing that to the curb as they serve the interests of foreign countries. Now, this goes far beyond the naivete of, maybe, as I will say a little bit in an interview, I'm sure. This goes far beyond the naivete that some people have of just getting a little extra help from someone with maybe some curious connections that they don't really know about. These are people that know what they're doing and are willingly doing it. And the report that has come out is protecting these people. So far, no one is naming names. Chrystia Freeland is not naming names and had this to say when asked about why the government won't.
Matters of criminal charges have to be left to law enforcement agencies. But since we don't know who these MPs are that have been alleged to help foreign state actors, can you give any guarantee to Canadians that if they are Liberals, they will be removed from caucus?
The guarantee I can give to Canadians is our government takes foreign interference very, very seriously. I'm just going to say personally, we and I are very grateful to this committee for its serious and thoughtful work. It's an issue about the fight between democracy and authoritarianism, and that is absolutely the way that our government does and will continue to approach it. And I want to reemphasize, we take very seriously the role of law enforcement.
Sorry, the question was, are you going to kick people who have been collaborating with foreign governments out of your caucus? The answer was, I am very grateful to the committee. We take this very serious. This is like the old joke that I shared after I watched an Aaron O'Toole press conference. And I said, next time my wife asks me if I did the dishes, I'll just say, I value clean dishes. And it's imperative that the dishes we eat off of are clean or something. This is, I think, so fascinating to me. Sean Fraser, I won't play the clip because I don't feel like listening to him again. But he was asked about this, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, whenever it was. And he gave the answer that, no, we can't name the names because then people would know how to interfere in our democracy by knowing who's for sale. You'd know if you hear the names, but you need to name the names. This is not at all controversial. Liberal, Conservative, New Democrat, Bloc Québécois, Green, I do not care. These are people who are selling out their country. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has called on the government to name names.
Mr. Speaker, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians has indicated that members of this House purposely helped hostile foreign actors. Canadians have a right to know who and what the information was.
committee indicates there are members of this House that have knowingly worked for foreign hostile governments. Canadians have a right to know who and what is the information. Who are they?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition knows very well that no government, including the government of which he was a member, is going to discuss particularities of intelligence information publicly, so he knows better than that. But the good news, Mr. Speaker, is if he wanted to get the appropriate security clearance and be able to see the confidential report of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, he would be much more informed than he is now, and we would invite him to do so he wouldn't stand up and cast aspersions on the floor of the House of Commons without any information whatsoever.
Oh, a little bit of a dog whistle to that online conspiracy theory that Pierre Poilievre can't get security clearance. That's Dominic LeBlanc saying, oh, no, he could get cleared and read the whole report if he wants. Well, yes, but then if he did, he would be unable to talk about national security issues. He'd be unable to hold the government to account. He does not want a gag order, which is a sentiment that was shared by Yves-François Blanchet as well. But it isn't just the Conservatives attacking the Liberals for this. Even Justin Trudeau's best buddy, Jagmeet Singh, has called on the government to name names.
Witting MPs who may have colluded with a foreign state be named? And should those names be public?
Well, there absolutely needs to be additional steps. The fact that the Prime Minister's known about this has done nothing, and the fact that the Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, doesn't want to know about this is deeply troubling. What we want to see happen is next steps. So let's see the next. First of all, moving forward, what should happen? There should be an investigation. Charges should be brought forward. Due process should be followed. But there can't just be an ignoring of what are very serious allegations. And so far, that seems to be the approach of Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre.
But should they be confidently that none of those MPs are in your caucus or have been in an NDP caucus federally?
I have no reason to believe and no evidence in front of me, and I've heard no information that in any way suggests New Democrat members of Parliament. But I want to get more information. That's why I requested a classified briefing. I will be receiving that briefing and looking at that information to confirm that.
I'm inclined to agree with Jagmeet Singh, by the way. I actually don't think any New Democrat members of Parliament are implicated in this. Not because I think that they're the most incredibly patriotic people, but because if you are trying to interfere in democracy, I feel that going after a New Democrat member of Parliament is like the lowest return on investment. Like, they have no power, they're irrelevant. So the idea of, like, you would get fired as a foreign agent at the Chinese embassy, I think, if you deployed your capital to win over Nikki Ashton or Charlie Angus or something like that, because that is not going to help you, take over Canada. But anyway, neither here nor there. The point is, you have now a cross-partisan condemnation of the way the government is handling this, and I think the reason the Liberals are not disclosing this is because they know the bulk, if not all, of the names on that list are from within their own caucus. But it's not even that they're not committing to naming names. They're not even committing to expelling people who have been acting for foreign governments from their caucus if they are Liberals. That tells you everything. And now they're saying, oh, it's the police that have to look after it. Now, the RCMP sent this very vague, weird, roundabout statement saying, yes, there are some accusations that have to do with democratic institutions, and we're on it. And yeah, the RCMP, they're going to be on it like they were on SNC-Lavalin. They're going to be on it like they were on all of these other things. I'm absolutely sure. The takeaway from all of this is that things have gotten far worse in this country than I think we even realized. And then even a lot of the reporting we saw on this from Global News and from the Globe and Mail suggested. The gentleman I wanted to bring in on this is Sam Cooper, who has been one of the, actually the biggest and most prominent and prolific journalist on this issue since the get-go on this, formerly my colleague at Global News, and now he's doing great work over at the Bureau. Sam Cooper joins me. Sam, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, obviously, none of these revelations are good for the country, but there must be a bit of vindication on your part, because I know you were facing, when you were reporting on this many months ago, criticism and people downplaying it. And here we are finding, no, it was actually worse than a lot of people thought.
Yeah, Andrew, I mean, it's an interesting situation. What we reported at Global News, as you say, has been confirmed 100% accurate. That doesn't stop certain lawsuits from occurring. And so the situation here is, you're right, it's worse than we reported. It's worse than the Globe and Mail reported. And I currently have information, about names and situations, things that would shock Canadians. And I agree with the calls in Parliament that names should be named. The RCMP should be investigating. There should be, criminal investigations underway. And yet, the first thing I'd like to stress is, the lawsuits, lawyers, politicians, business people behind them can stand in the way of our democracy. So I think that's an important issue for Canadians to understand.
The word that everyone seized on from the NSICOP report, and I think justifiably so, was wittingly. So these are not people that were too naive to realize that maybe a busload of volunteers that showed up on their campaign might have been involved in some foreign state. These are people who knowingly were collaborating. And does that, because that's the part that I think is so very damaging here. These are people that, as again, this cross-partisan report shows, were actively working against Canada, well, in some cases being parliamentarians.
Yeah, that's the whole point. And, to unpack the thinking and the reporting, this is why Canadian officials had to risk their careers, risk their freedoms, because they could face prosecutions for coming to me with classified information, both in document form and verbally, saying that the government at the highest levels, not just Justin Trudeau, but this has been happening for a while. Certainly, in my view, some politicians are more implicated than others. But the Liberal Party right now faces, the responsibility that they've been warned for years that their party especially was implicated, but it was much broader. All politicians are targeted in both houses, as we just heard in the NSICOP bombshell review. And yet this government, others prior, haven't done enough, but this government is especially implicated. So yes, what I reported at Global News was some, candidates were believed by intelligence to be wittingly receiving benefits, campaign support, funds from the Chinese Communist Party. That's why they were called part of a loosely coordinated network. And so some other politicians semi-witting, some perhaps not witting. But again, that if you take that, you're wittingly receiving benefits from a foreign state. And I'll add, the proxies involved are much worse than officials. They're involved in very deeply concerning activities in Canada. You take those benefits, of course, it's the unescapable inference that you're going to be doing something back, and that is being used as a puppet in the legislature. That's why, Canadians are freshly shocked with these new revelations.
I was sharing some clips earlier in the show of, now the NDP and Conservatives saying release the names and the Liberals hemming and hawing about it. But there's a lot of buck passing going on. You have the committee saying, no, we aren't able to release names. You've got the government now saying, no, police have to deal with this. Who has the authority to do this? Who has the authority to just release the names?
Unfortunately, I don't believe, barring another set of leaks, it's quite possible that names won't be released, or we may be into a situation with what happened with the Winnipeg lab, where people quite clearly could see something very bad was happening within the lab. The opposition parties were saying to the government, release the details. Canadians need to know. The government was fighting that. And so there was a compromise, legally, there was a special little black box created where certain information was released. And, then CSIS documents came out with some names, of course, redacted, but Canadians found more. Maybe that's the situation that occurred here, but we're in a real Gordian knot because, as my reporting has revealed from November 2022, Canada lacks the laws to really prosecute politically sensitive cases, right? This is why we're in this bind. And yet, as I've reported for the Bureau this week, maybe the most powerful finding of that NSICOP report is they said Justin Trudeau was told in 2019 by NSICOP, you need to follow Australia, get a registry, work on the CSIS Act, the RCMP Act, so we can counter this deeply damaging and increasing foreign interference. And NSICOP said this week, Justin Trudeau didn't act, and it's a serious failure that could harm Canada for years. So, if you ask me, to me, The names are important, but what's more important is we need laws to empower the RCMP and CSIS. We need an independent anti-corruption agency that could actually prosecute people working for foreign governments. And, Canadians should be saying, give us the names, but give us the laws.
Yeah, I think that's an important point here because sure, they could be kicked out of caucus conceivably, or maybe they don't run for re-election, but that is not enough of a consequence for someone who is effectively, to be blunt here, selling out their country or betraying their country in this way. And I wanted to ask you about some of those countries here, because obviously the report names the ones that we all talk about in the context of foreign interference often, specifically China, Iran, and India. But there are other countries that are implicated that are not named, that are redacted. And are these just open secrets in the community? And why are they not being named? Why are they being given the benefit of protection here by the committee, in your view?
Well, in my view, my reporting, including accessing the 2019 classified Canadian eyes only NSICOP report that told Mr. Trudeau, you need to do something about these countries. After I reported that India was named very, prominently in that 2019 document, now, Justice Hoag's commission, following my reporting at the Bureau, had to say, give us the information on India. So I would say, without, patting my back too much, my work made India be exposed in that way. Before people were saying Russia is the big actor. Now we know China and India. So to your question, who are those redacted countries? If I'm looking at the 2019 precedent document from NSICOP, a major report on foreign interference, I would say Pakistan, very likely the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and perhaps, some other Middle Eastern oriented states, quite possibly Iran, would be named in that document. And why is that important? Andrew, for people that follow the Bureau, they know I've been reporting. It hasn't made its way to other media yet, very much, I don't think, that organized crime is centrally used as a tool by these hostile states to attack our diasporas that came to Canada for freedoms, that want to vote for who they'd like to be vote, but they're being intimidated to vote for what thug hostile state countries want them to do in Canada.
So why do you think the committee is protecting those countries then? I mean, because if you really delve into it, a lot of the time identifying the country helps you identify the person involved. And you can, because a lot of the times which politicians have connections to which diaspora communities. And that's not to say that there's a necessary guilt there, but I also wonder if they're hiding the countries because doing so really obscures the people a bit more.
Yeah, there's all kinds of, obfuscation or dark reasons that could be going on. I'm just speculating today because it doesn't make sense to me. Look, if the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is in that document, why, at this point, why are you hiding that from the Canadian people? I don't know that, but it's quite possible. I'm told by my sources that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been very active in a dangerous way, in sending agents into Canada. So that, brings up the case of why didn't Canadians know for a few years that Indian agents using organized crime or Chinese agents using organized crime were targeting our diasporas? So why aren't these other countries that are, less powerful, less involved in the diasporas than China and India named? Who knows? If I have to guess right now, and don't hold me to it, maybe there are trade issues that would make sense. Arms deals, I don't know. Just count the number of reasons. It could be anything.
I just apologize. I'm in a hotel right now, so if you hear construction above me, it was a very inopportune timing to you and the listeners here. But
one of my window, that's what it is.
One of the things that jumps out to me, and I go back to your point about lacking the means to prosecute these things, is that we have an election coming up in a little over a year. And sure, maybe public awareness about this will help a little bit. Politicians will be a little bit more on guard. But if you haven't actually changed the legal mechanisms to what you were saying, Sam, we aren't really in any better position to protect against this moving forward, are we?
Not at all. Again, let me stress very clearly, when the Bureau launched last June, my very first story said Justin Trudeau's administration has been firmly warned by NSICOP, recommended you need a foreign agent registry like Australia, the UK now, America has. You need to empower the RCMP to go after, people involved, whether they're politicians or proxies for other states, what came out of that NSICOP report this week is that, sure, we know these are deeply concerning cases. I could read the list. Politicians allegedly knowingly receiving money laundering like transactions, acting for other governments once they receive campaign support. So these should be crimes in a real, let's don't sugarcoat it. These are crimes in a real modern state, but not in Canada. So we're not in a better position at all. And again, this isn't partisan at all. The evidence is Justin Trudeau should have acted and he didn't. That's what NSICOP said this week. I'm not, born as a critic or of Justin Trudeau. That's the evidence. And, if Mr. Poilievre wins the next election, he had better take the lesson. When intelligence tells you your laws need to change, you'd better do it, or it's dereliction of duty, in my view.
Well, you do tremendous work at the Bureau, and it's oftentimes trickles a few weeks later into other media outlets. But wait, don't wait unnecessarily. Just read it at the Bureau first, everyone. Sam Cooper, and also I would recommend checking out Sam Cooper's book, Willful Blindness. Sam, appreciate you coming on. Very good work on this.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks again to Sam Cooper for coming on the show. And again, just to drive home the point I made earlier about how the Liberal government is not taking this seriously. This morning, this was all being discussed at committee, and I chanced upon this tweet from Mercedes Stevenson, a great journalist who shares that Jennifer O'Connell, the Liberal member of Parliament, was telling Conservatives who are concerned about this, quote, "Boo-hoo, get over it." Now, this is a heckle, so I don't know if the quality of the clip is good enough to share with you here. But the reality is, this is, I think, the dismissive attitude we're seeing about something that Canadians should be taking incredibly, incredibly seriously. I want to get some political response to this. We'll also talk about this capital gains tax hike that doesn't seem to be materializing. Adam Chambers, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Simcoe North, joins me now. Adam, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Now, you've been in Parliament for a few years now, and I know the foreign interference issue has continued to rise in terms of prominence. But how did you feel as a member of Parliament when you get this report that was assembled by some of your colleagues, that some of the people you're in the House of Commons with have been, as the report says, wittingly working against Canada's interests, basically?
Well, look, it was deeply troubling to read the report. I'm still going through it as well. We have had a government who's clearly not been taking this as seriously as it should have been. And I think people like Sam Cooper and others at the Globe that have been following this very, very closely have really pushed the government and exposed many of the stories. And in fact, we wouldn't have these stories had some of these leaks not happened. And, people like Sam who've done the work have really been vindicated with what we've seen in this report.
Now, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has, alongside Jagmeet Singh, I should point out, called on the government to release the names. Do you have any tools available as an opposition party to actually make the government do this? And is that something you'll be continuing to hammer in the remaining couple of weeks you have in the House of Commons before the summer session, before the session ends for summer?
Well, I suspect that all opposition parties will canvass all of the tools that they have to encourage the government to release the names. But let's be honest, this is a government who took a former speaker to court to prevent releasing information with respect to the Winnipeg lab docs. So, I think, we will do what we can. But clearly, as you mentioned in the lead in here, the Liberal government and some of its members aren't really treating this with the level of seriousness it deserves. I think Canadians expect some more information on this. And let's remember, the government who had all of the information was the one who was saying for multiple months that an inquiry wasn't needed. They were the ones who were dragged into the inquiry by all opposition parties. They tried to avoid doing that. Recall former Governor General David Johnston said, "Nothing to see here, please move along." But yet, in fact, we then find in this explosive report that we absolutely need more information. So I was happy that all opposition parties seem to be calling for the same thing. So we will have a couple weeks left to push the government to release more information.
Just lastly, if there are any Conservative MPs implicated in this, will they be, as you understand it, out of the caucus?
Well, look, I think we'd have to deal with the information when we receive it. Let's first get the names, then we can decide what we do with those individuals. I suspect there are varying degrees of actions, and depending on, are these individuals still in caucus today? Are they former parliamentarians? Do they reside in the Senate? Do they, are they part of a caucus? Are they not? At least what we need is more information, and I think then we should appropriately deal with those individuals based on the seriousness of what is alleged to have occurred.
What I had originally wanted to get you on the show about, you had asked Chrystia Freeland earlier this week in the House of Commons about this impending, I don't even know if it is impending anymore. It's supposed to be an impending capital gains tax hike. This was originally promised by the Liberals in the budget going back to, I think, April 16th. And it's supposed to come into effect in less than 3 weeks. And the government has still not implemented any legislation to this effect. And to the contrary, they've said it's coming. So just what on earth is happening here? Let's start there.
Well, let's just talk about process. So April 16th, there's a budget. In the budget, the government indicates that it will increase the taxes on capital gains on effective June 25th. By the way, they also increased the taxes on the excise tax on cigarettes. That was implemented immediately. So normally tax changes are implemented immediately, but the government said it wanted to give people time to plan and set an implementation date of June 25th. Now, they're being a little too cute by half. The reason why the government's giving people time to plan is because it will force a lot of transactions to occur between the budget and June 25th, which will trigger a lot of revenues because people will pay taxes after they dispose assets. But the truth is, when a government introduces or makes mentions of a tax change, that change does take effect. So CRA will still execute or implement this tax change on June 25th, even without legislation. But I think, and conservatives have said, this is just patently unfair for individuals to expect to arrange their affairs or sell assets with no legislation or no rules in place. It's only a matter of proper process that they have legislation before they may choose to decide to sell assets. For example, we're hearing a number of rumors that the government's considering some carve-outs for physicians, maybe some carve-outs for those in the real estate sector, maybe carve-outs for families or farmers, who knows? But I think they owe it to Canadians who are trying to figure out how to deal with this increased tax to show them the legislation so that they can arrange their affairs appropriately.
Yeah, and just for people that aren't aware of this, when you mention physicians, this is a group that in lieu of fee increases some years back had an arrangement that many of them have used where they use their professional corporations, they use their assets as their retirement plan, basically. So this is incredibly important. And we're not, yes, family doctors do all right, but we're not talking about these, billionaires and their yachts here. We're talking about small business owners that have structured their life and their work around this. And you're right. So they may be doing some, mass sell-off of assets in this interregnum period without realizing that, they didn't need to.
Correct. It's quite, it would be quite frustrating, I could imagine, for somebody to go through the process, sell some assets, all of a sudden to find out that the government has changed its mind. And it's not like that hasn't happened before. The most recent example was what many have called the Bear Trust scandal, which was the government requiring CRA requiring a number of filings for those who have bare trusts, only to reverse the decision on the day before the filings were due. And we found out that over 40,000 people, 43,000 individuals filed the paperwork for the bare trusts at an average. Most people paid an average of anywhere between $500 and $1,000 per filing. So a complete boondoggle by the government that created a ton of additional complexity and compliance costs for taxpayers to then realize they didn't have to do it in the first place. So what will happen with the capital gains? Maybe there will be carve-outs. And Minister Freeland's response in the House indicates that the legislation won't be finalized. It won't be tabled. Maybe we'll get a Ways and Means motion. Maybe they'll just publish draft legislation on the finance website. But there's no way they will have a bill tabled and passed before June 25th.
Just to go back to your objection here, is it just the process you take issue with, or is it the capital gains tax increase itself? Like, will you and the Conservatives vote against that when it comes?
Well, it's hard to say you're going to vote for or against a bill you haven't seen yet. So if they table a Ways and Means motion within a couple of weeks before we go, I think we'll have an opportunity to go through it. But let's think about why they are bringing in this tax increase in the first place. Well, the reason the government needs this revenue is because the spending has just continued to grow and grow out of control. So if you were to not do the spending, which we have impressed upon the government for the last number of years, slow down your spending growth, rein in some of these programs. You don't have to keep adding spending every single year. If you took that spending pressure away, you wouldn't have the pressure to be raising taxes.
But if it were presented without carve-outs the way it initially was in the budget, would you support or oppose it?
Well, look, two things. One, it's a piece of financial legislation which is a confidence measure for the government, and we have voted against every single confidence measure that this government has brought forward and every single piece of financial legislation that this government's brought forward. So, that will give you a little bit of an indication of where my personal leanings are.
All right. Well, Adam Chambers, a member of Parliament for Simcoe North. Good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Thanks again to Adam Chambers. That's actually quite a fascinating angle he raised in that interview there, in talking about how this basically triggers the panic. People sell off their assets. Government gets to collect a windfall and use that to basically spend more money without incurring any debt. It's some 3D chess from Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau. And again, it's kind of speaking to a bit of a mindset, but I think there's something to that. The government gets to benefit from the uncertainty right now, which is quite something. So I wanted to do another segment here that looks at the media. We had such great feedback from our chat with Peter Menzies. I caught up back when I was in the studio before I left for Ottawa with Lydia Miljan. Take a look.
You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We've had a bit of a theme emerge this week. It wasn't intentional from the outset, but there's been lots of material on it, which is the status and health or lack thereof of the media industry in Canada. And we generally have two camps on this. I spoke to Jen Gerson of The Line a few weeks ago, and she says we have to be comfortable with the idea of collapse so that something new can come from the ashes. And then we have the Government of Canada approach, which is basically to subsidize media so that hopefully it can limp along and survive just a little bit longer, maybe until right after the next election. Who knows? Well, there was a fascinating piece I read from Professor Lydia Miljan at the Fraser Institute. She's a professor at the University of Windsor in political science, and she looks at federal support for journalism with a very empirical lens. And I thought there was a lot to take away from this. So it's my delight to bring Professor Miljan onto the show. Lydia, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure, Andrew.
So you touched on something in a much more academically rigorous way than my chit chat with Jen Gerson last week, but you get to the same conclusion, I think, which is that we need to be comfortable with the idea of there being a change in the industry like we see in everything else. No one talks about keeping the horse carriage industry alive. No one talks about keeping analog washing machines alive. All of these things have been replaced by something else. But with media, we're not seeing that. People are very uncomfortable with the idea of a market-forced reinvention.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a crazy system that we're in, that we assume that market failures are always bad. And I understand that there's some sentimentality to this, right? You're always concerned that people are going to lose their jobs, and that you don't want people to go without their professions. But on the other hand, if nobody's watching, if nobody's consuming your product, what is the point of it? There certainly there is a public service aspect of the media, but there is also a business aspect of it. And if it can't make the business case, then perhaps we allow for industries to go under and certain corporations to go under, and yes, job losses, but at the same time it allows innovation. And that's one of the biggest problems I find with this country, is that we don't have enough innovation. There's too much of a reliance on asking the government to prop everything up, and they're propping up failing industries. And when you look at the data coming in, there were all sorts of subsidies during the pandemic. There was all sorts of buyouts and bailouts for the media. And it doesn't look like it saved a journalist, even one journalist job. In fact, we've lost hundreds of journalist jobs to companies that actually received those very generous payments from the government.
Well, and you're right. There's an emotional attachment to the media, which I get. I think journalists sometimes can be a bit too lofty about what it is. And you had a quote from Roy Thompson in your paper here, which I had actually not read before, that I thought was a nice reality check. He said, "I buy newspapers to make money, to buy more newspapers to make more money." And it's not to undermine the work that journalists do, but newspapers are businesses. They are for-profit commercial enterprises. The number of nonprofit media organizations in Canada is very, well, I mean, there are lots that don't turn a profit, but the number that are registered nonprofits is very small. So it is especially weird through that lens. These are businesses that seem to have this special place carved out in people's hearts, in the government's heart.
There is, and I certainly wouldn't be someone to say we need more nonprofits or more government. There's a difference between nonprofits and government supported, but I think we need more government supported media. We have a CBC and it has its own problems. And one of the largest concern of that problem is that they don't have to innovate. They've never really had to rely on their audiences. And again, ratings, they sort of snub their nose at advertising and audience sizes, saying, well, we want to give people what they need rather than necessarily what they want. Well, you can't be force feeding it to people, right? As their audiences are declining, we just keep on giving them more money, and that's not solving any problem. It's not allowing that public function. All they end up doing is becoming their own echo chamber, which they criticize other echo chambers for. So, all the other media outlets are in fact for profit, and that's why newspapers really used to be a license to print money. They had an amazing ability with innovation, right? If you think about the history of journalism, it started with one person community presses. They were weeklies, and be a person cranking out, usually a man cranking out this weekly newspaper, making a few bucks. But then with innovation, with modernization, with commercialization, you got bigger newspapers, you got the newspaper chains, and that's where the Pulitzer and Randolph Hearst and all those great names of journalism made their millions, because they were able to sell a product, both like they were penny sheets, so they sold to the public, but because there was such a high volume of public consuming it, they actually made their main money off of advertising. And that model worked great until about the 1980s. And then you saw in the 1980s, the whole business starting to be really, we were concerned about concentration of ownership then, that there were too few chains owned by too few people. We had the Kent Commission, and they actually recommended government intervention. The government of the day said, no, we'll pass. We don't think that it is right for the government to be propping up the media, that this is freedom of speech, and it's not a good idea for them to be entering into the private sector. And so now we're in a really bizarre situation where our current government thinks that is the only way to move forward. They are so blindsided by the need that they're going to save journalism with subsidies that they can't imagine that people can actually innovate with, so if news organizations fall and you allow that to happen, it does open up the market for entrants, because people are always going to be consuming news. People want information. They just don't necessarily like the information they're getting right now.
So we have now a couple of years of data on this, that since the government put a few measures in place. There are things like the local journalism initiative. There was the big $580 million fund, which I think was increased. You have the figure at $885 million overall that's gone into journalism in the last 5 years, which doesn't count money to CBC, which is $1.4 billion a year. Has this worked? Has this achieved anything?
As far as I can tell, it's just made it easier for those companies to lay off reporters. I mean, we've had massive layoffs in BCE. We have newspapers closing right, left, and center. It doesn't seem to be doing anything in terms of actual journalist jobs. It certainly helped corporations' bottom line. It certainly allowed for some corporations to give their executives bonuses, but in terms of actually saving journalists' positions, no. And I see increasingly, when I go online, I see increasingly a number of journalists who have left the industry either by choice or by edict, and they're doing other things. And they're opening other news organizations. Sometimes they're going into the private sector, but certainly we've seen job losses rather than any, even you could say say it would be successful if there were no journalists who lost their jobs in the last 3 years. That is certainly not the case. We have incredible job losses, and they seem to be continuing. And there's shows that, BCE had announced huge layoffs. They laid off a huge number of really senior journalists, well-respected journalists by industry standards, and they just did a wholesale cut of both programs and positions.
Yeah, and I'm almost, this will sound very Machiavellian on my part, but I'm almost glad in a way that it's not working, because that would sort of cement this as being part of just the permanent subsidization of the media. But so we're back to square one here. I mean, some people in the media, and specifically the newspaper industry, say this is all a sign that they need to do more, that it's not enough. But I think most people should hopefully take your view on this, which is, okay, let's actually pull this back and start talking about the market forces. Because right now, the incentive to reinvent, the incentive to find a way forward for traditional media just hasn't been there. The way they adapt to these things is just by cutting and cutting and cutting. And that doesn't really deal with the core problem.
Right, and they're not. I mean, there's been some innovations, like some organizations get podcasts out. I mean, I'm not about this obviously True North.
No, and they all have websites. I mean, that in and of itself is an adaptation.
And I'm going to give kudos, right? You're an innovator, right? You are outside the traditional model, and you're creating your own spaces. And we don't see that kind of innovation when it comes to the traditional media outlets. They are very comfortable in how they put out the news. They're comfortable in their brand, and they certainly are excited about getting more government money. But the problem with getting more government money is that you don't have that hunger at the doorstep, propelling you to try new things. And then there's that whole other disaster that the government does with their online news act, and they're trying to pressure the big tech giants. I mean, there's a lot of money still to be made in the news industry. It's just not being made by the people that the government wants to make money. But certainly Google and YouTube and all these new startups have made billions of dollars in the news industry. And the argument, and I at one point, a few years ago, I sort of got sucked into this argument myself, where it's like, oh, the big tech giants aren't paying their fair share. They're using traditional media outlets as clickbait, and they're just writing off their coattails, and so they should be paying them something for their content. And I see that in terms of intellectual property. They can't just scrape the data off of traditional sites. They should compensate them somehow. And there were some private deals being made, but then the government sticks its oar in and say, we're going to force you to pay a certain amount, and we're going to negotiate with you, which meant that a lot of those private deals went sideways, and it resulted in Canadians not even being able to access news on social media sites. And a lot of those traditional news medias were innovative, saying, well, we aren't getting people to dial in through traditional cable or over the air, but we can get people to watch our Facebook live streams or our Twitter streams. And Twitter and Facebook to this day don't allow media content. We don't even allow us to share news stories amongst our friends on that platform anymore. So they've made it that much more difficult for startups to begin. I mean, I live in a small town in Southern Ontario, and our newspaper had folded a few years back, but there were some enterprising people in town that said, no, we still need a community paper. And they did it through Facebook. And that online news act actually prevents that company from sharing local news, and really the only venue that was successful for them. So government not only subsidizes the wrong things, tries to pick the wrong winners and losers, but in addition to that, they get in the way of innovators.
So it's not saving jobs, which we've discussed. And you also make another point, Lydia, which I think is incredibly important, which is that it's not bringing audiences back. Now, this is, I think, incredibly important because C-18, the Online News Act notwithstanding, it's not hard to access news. It's not even like you need to be in range of the radio now in most cases. You can listen to the website cast on newspapers. You can read it all online. So when audiences are shrinking in size, that's because audiences are not wanting wanting to seek it out. They're not wanting to do it. That's not a subsidy problem. That's not a business model problem. I don't know what the answer is. I suspect trust is part of it. I suspect just the bombardment in popular culture. You have more options now, so you don't need to be as reliant on one individual newspaper or one individual radio station as you used to be. But news companies should be looking at that question more than just the funding equation.
Absolutely. They need to be providing the content that people are seeking. And, I consume a lot of news, and I do subscribe to different news organizations. And I do find it frustrating. And this is always something that academics complain about, is that the news is so homogeneous, right? That everyone's covering the same story with the same lens. And I spent decades comparing, different news organizations on how they covered the main stories. And, there are some small differences. Let's say if you compare CBC and CTV, CBC is more left of center. CTV tends to be a little bit more central. I wouldn't say they were right wing by any stretch, but that's one of the problems, is that Canadians aren't willing to just accept what traditional sort of mainstream, that liberal left of center viewpoint, the position that that organizations are doing, like that they're always giving you the same messaging, is falling short. People want alternative perspectives. They want new ideas. They want to hear not just the same headlines. Like if you listen to, say, and I've been traveling this week, so I've been listening to a lot of CBC, because that's the only thing I've been getting. And the stories that they cover aren't necessarily the stories that I'm interested in, and they're always sort of from that same lens. So yeah, I then go on Twitter and I go to other news organizations to get different points of view, because people. It's not that this is sort of a classic adage of journalism. It's not that journalism tells you what to think, but they tell you what to think about. And I think that's where people are saying, you know what, we're kind of tired of you telling us this type of messaging to think about. We want to think about other things.
The paper in the Fraser Institute, Federal Support for Journalism. Academics, they always you're always good. You can just do the literal title. You don't need to come up with idioms like I do in my work to sell it. But it was a very good piece. A lot of detail in there that I think is important to keep in mind. Professor Lydia Miljan, thank you so much for your time. Good to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Andrew.
You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
That was a great interview. Thanks again to Lydia Miljan, to Sam Cooper, to Adam Chambers, to all those who joined the show today. It was a bit of a packed one, a lot of news to work in there. I will be back in the regular studio next week and also back for Off the Record tomorrow. So do tune into that if you want something that even manages to surpass the irreverence we strive for on the Andrew Lawton Show. But if that's not your bag, that's all right. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you. God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to the Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.